So recording this in part because we have some pre-recorded contributors from other locations, and we want them to have the opportunity to also learn from the fabulous folks that are here in real time. Do people still use RL, right? Or is that like from the 1980s? RL.
Real life?
Real life or real time? Do people still use that? Okay, good. Am I in? Is that good?
Yeah.
Great. So just a little bit of context for what we're going to be talking about today, and then I'm going to do some sort of short name introductions and discuss the format. Of course, many of us are in the room today because we know that Black Lives Matter and the hashtag #MeToo movement have pushed concepts like transformative justice, across the globe. For us, transformative justice is a community-based abolitionist response to sexual, interpersonal, and gender-based violence. For us, it also, here in the United States, draws in part on indigenous systems of justice and liberation. But we also know that transformative justice is moving in other contexts like Germany, the United Kingdom, Australia, and we might hear in the Q&A a little bit from Canada, and how these transformative justice practices are connecting with local genealogies and histories and practices of struggle within these other nation states, and also other histories of gender-based and sexual violence. Melanie, with a little bit of support from me, curated a fantastic set of questions to send around to our international participants today, asking people to both, in a short time, which is a major challenge, to talk a little bit about the context in which they're working and operating, a little bit of context of the carceral state, and then floated a number of other questions and asked people to consider picking up some of these questions to talk about today. So in addition to a little bit about their context, what are the conversations about abolition and transformative justice or community accountability that are emerging or have emerged in the sites that they're working in? What does transformative justice or community accountability inspired work look like? Why is it happening? How is it happening? What harms is it addressing? What models, if any, are people using? How are people thinking about scale, about relationship to the nation state, about flexibility and sustainability? So those are some of the questions that we floated, and clearly today we're not going to have enough time to address all of those questions. But we see this, and this is actually the third sort of roundtable format that Melanie has organized. One happened last summer with the ICOPA, and I see some ICOPA folks in the room. And another one happened in Berlin, also at the end of summer. So this is the third sort of attempt to have these international conversations around what does transformative justice look like in abolitionist feminist praxis in different kinds of contexts. So today we're sort of picking up and continuing that internationalist move, and our format is going to be, we're going to start, because we're nationalistic, no, just kidding, we're going to start in the United States with Shirley, Leslie from Critical Resistance, yay, and Mimi Kim from many places, Creative Interventions, University of California, Long Beach, brilliant visionary like so many other folks on the panel. And we're going to move geographically to Germany to hear from Melanie Brazzell and Vanessa Thompson. And Melanie Brazzell is at University of California, Santa Barbara, and also part of the Berlin Transformative Justice Collective. And Vanessa Thompson is at the Goethe University of Frankfurt. And then we're going to move to Australia and hear a pre-recorded comment from Lauren Caulfield and Anne-lise, and I'm blanking on Anne-lise's last name for this second, Anne-lise Affat, right? So there's gorgeous little bios up here as well. And then we're going to move, those are pre-recorded comments because it's some ungodly hour right now in the UK, or in Australia. And then we're going to hear live in person from Kelsey, Mohamed, and Rosabelle Ackhurst. And Rosabelle Ackhurst is from Birkbeck College, and Rape Crisis is what I have here. And Kelsey Mohamed, I have Community Action in Prison Community Active Prison Expansion.
Action on prison expansion.
Okay, so we're going to hear a little about that. So that's the framework, for our, and each sort of pair is going to have about 12 minutes or so. Again, we're doing the sort of challenging task of trying to set a little bit of context, but then trying to pick up a little bit, some specificity to sort of build these international connections. What kinds of practices are people building? How's work translating or moving across borders? In what ways are people conceptualizing relationships to the state? How are people thinking about flexibility, sustainability? What forms of harm are being prioritized or not in this work? What are some challenges? And we'll hopefully have at least 15 to 20 minutes for dialogue afterward. Does that sound good? Great? Yes? Sound good? Fabulous panelists? Okay, excellent. We're going to start with, and I'm probably not going to do time. Maybe I'll just do a little bit of nudging if people are way over. Does that sound good? Great. We're going to start in the United States with Shirley, Leslie, and Nini Kim. Welcome.
Hi everyone, my name is Shirley, and I'm going to talk a little bit about critical resistance and the way we deal with gender responsive prisons and transformative justice. Yeah. Thank you.
Great.
I don't know how to get rid of this thing.
That's okay.
Great. Oh, the bottom button, the third to the bottom button, I think.
Third to the middle button.
There you go.
Whoa, okay. Is that all right with people?
Yeah.
All right, people with the light? Okay, great. Sorry, Shirley.
Good. So Critical Resistance is a grassroots abolitionist organization, and we're seeking to build an international movement to end the prison industrial complex by challenging the belief that caging and controlling people makes us safe in any way. So from now on, I'm going to refer to the prison industrial complex as the PIC, by the way. Yeah, if anyone has any questions about critical resistance or just needs some more substance with that, feel free to talk to me after. I'm going to try to focus a lot more on the our responses to gender responsive prisons and transformative justice. So over the past couple decades, we've participated in coalition against a number of jail expansion proposals, several of which have been touted under the guise of meeting the needs of women and queer people. So there was a 2006 proposal for women's prison expansion that was going to be for around like 4,500 women prisoners that were deemed by the state to be low-risk offenders, and this was all under the pretense of addressing the specific needs of cis and trans women. So the prisons that were uplifted as successful models by proponents of the proposal either had inadequate resources or just non-existent resources, contrary to everything that they were telling the public and key decision makers for that proposal. And so if the proposal had passed, it would have increased women's prisons beds in California up to around 40% in the 2 years following that. So as I'm sure we all know, a lot of people in women's prisons suffer from severe and often life-threatening mental and physical illnesses that reflect the lack of access to preventative care for low-income communities and communities of color. And so there are no ways in a carceral environment to address those health conditions, and often being imprisoned either causes or exacerbates those existing conditions. And sadly, as I'm sure a lot of us know, inside prison there are a lot of human rights abuses specifically catered toward women and queer people, and that can be in the form of sexual abuse, medical neglect, or brutal violence. So time and again we've fought against similar proposals, knowing very well that in a carceral environment you can never and will never address the systemic societal needs of women and queer people. That mode of inclusion and recognition is purely exploitative and just a way to extend the scope of the PIC. And so then and now, we advocate for those jail funds to be reallocated to community resources that women, girls, transgender, and gender nonconforming people actually need, such as housing, healthcare, education, employment, community-based responses to interpersonal harm, and that's all away from the criminal legal system. And only then can we actually achieve any kind of gender justice. So, a little bit about one of our campaigns that we're working on right now. We are part of the No New SF Jail Coalition, specifically in a campaign to shut down the jail at 850 Bryant in San Francisco. So our goals in that are to shut down the seismically unsafe facility, chip away at the conditions of the punitive ways of our society, and have the city invest in actually community-led resources. And in all our work, we recognize how valuable transformative justice is as a method of community empowerment and accountability that works in tandem with the systemic changes that we know desperately need to happen. So in our literature that we provide to the public and to key decision makers in these matters, we always uplift numerous community organizations that are implementing and practicing transformative justice as examples of what could be invested in locally. A lot of the resources that we cite use transformative justice either internally in their organizations or externally in their community, and a lot deal with child sexual abuse as well. So some of the common denominators that we can see throughout all of the models in the organizations that we cite, the common desires are safety, healing, and agency of everyone involved, accountability and transformation of those who perpetrate the harm, community response and accountability outside of the state and the state's violence, and transformation of the community and the social conditions that create and perpetuate that violence. So the recommendations that we often propose also acknowledge that funding priorities have to be fundamentally shifted to provide for people's basic needs for housing, healthcare, food, water, community. And some of the organizations that we often uplift are Generation 5, the Young Women's Empowerment Project, are both defunct but definitely have resources listed on their sites. Project NIA, Hospitality House, and the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective. So some challenges and opportunities that we see with transformative justice. One of the logistical challenges of proposing it as a method of community empowerment, specifically in our jail fight right now, is that we don't want the state to be the arbiter of that method, ever. So we have to be very cautious and intentional in our advocacy for transformative justice centers and facilities and resources to be invested in, so that they don't become government-led, but invested in and uplifted in the community. So one of the greater challenges that we have with implementing transformative justice is that right now we don't have a way to implement this on a large scale, because there has to be a huge holistic societal ideological shift so that individual and community needs can be met, so that transformative justice can be more deeply rooted in some kind of massive framework. Thankfully, there are so many organizations that we see coming up every day that are bringing this into public discourse and implementing these methods, so that much is really, really empowering. And we acknowledge that transformative justice is not merely an alternative to modern policing and incarceration, but it's a fight to have our community needs met in that path toward collective growth. So, for example, in our current SF jail fight, we recognize that it might be difficult for people to attend meetings regularly in centers if they don't have their stable living conditions already. Or sometimes individuals aren't released from holding because the court requires a treatment bed and all of the nearby facilities don't have any space for that. So in that and many other cases, we know that the work toward health and accountability don't exist in a vacuum. People need to have their most basic needs met to be able to sustain this in any kind of real and holistic way. And one of the other foundational challenges is that we have to really dig deep into the nature of policing and understand that a lot of harm is being perpetrated by the state very intentionally. It's not always interpersonal harm. We also have to deal with the constant attacks by the state onto low-income communities, communities of color, and we just have to attack that at the root as well. And going along with that, the PIC definitely creates and perpetuates all of the conditions for that interpersonal harm. So it's having to really dig at the root of what harm can look like interpersonally and state-sanctioned. But the opportunities that we see are moments like this. We get to bring this into our framework and involve that in everything that we're doing, and we get to have these discourses and get to see it implemented on bigger scales when we see other organizations implementing transformative justice, it's really empowering. And it helps us figure out our viewpoints about intrapersonal and interpersonal harm. And some of the main things we think are very crucial for sustainability: community education and substantial investment in transformative justice centers and resources. And to ensure flexibility, just having a constant reassessment of the practices and the ideological basis behind it. So again, exactly what we're doing now, which is really exciting. Thank you.
Oh, there was somebody else there. Hi, everybody. Mimi Kim, and I'm the most associated with INCITE, which is the organization that started back in 2000, about 2 years after Critical Resistance, and Creative Interventions, and the work that some of us did at this point quite a while ago. But I've also been in a position, in part because if I hear about something, I'm going to call them and just harass people, where I feel like I'm in a position to know, like, in some ways, historically, some things about the development of what most people now refer to as transformative justice, at least in the United States. I'm very excited to have this place within an international context, because that's something I'm really not used to. So I'm not. I don't want to speak too much, because I want to make sure that we have like the time in an hour and a half to set more global context. I think so much of what you said, I could just say what Shirley said. What can I add to this? I think I have been one of those people that's been in a lot of the national floundering, like what are we doing kind of moments where whether it was Philly Stands Up with their action camp, or a bunch of us said, let's just get together, and got a place in Miami and called everybody out. I mean, to really take what's been very, very local kinds of projects and then see what we have in common, make sure we're collaborating, and make sure we uplift each other's work. I can say right now, I think up to this point, some of these organizations started like around 2000, so we're like 20 years in. It's a scrappy bunch, right? Yeah. Because most of us did this with no money or a little money, or we got money over here and we were just like, okay, we're gonna pull it over here. So I think some of the things I've been thinking about is now we have a lot of organizations that have, they are no longer. The thing about those organizations that are no longer is mostly the people are still, including myself, I think, still doing the work in whatever capacity we can, whatever hat we need to wear, whatever we need to do. And I think that's really kept the movement, if you want to call that, growing. Also, up to this point, I think we've been really collaborative. There's been a lot of solidarity. There's been like, wow, you do things really different, but let's look at what you're doing in your context, without claims to like, we are the best, please use ours, we're gonna copyright something, we're gonna, you have to pay for it, we're gonna make money off of this. I think that's been something I've been, and I compare that because I'm getting to know more of the restorative justice people who are always like, mine is the best. And I'm really, really white. So there's, and I hope that that's something that us, a spirit and obviously a politic that we can keep. Also, as organizations fall away, they have all kept their stuff alive. You can still download things. People just make their zines available, and everybody's really been, I think, keen on keeping a digital presence, however that's going to be. And then you have people like Miriam Kaba, who's like prolific as, I think maybe there's 12 Miriam Kabas, maybe, who's been like, all of us say we've got to document this stuff, and we've managed to, but then Maren goes, we're gonna talk about everything, and makes a giant website with all kinds of resources available. And so we've had everybody has their own contribution, their own genius. Each organization, BTGC, in terms of the pod, has been amazing. Just a little more to say, I think that this question of scaling up is very live right now.
Mm-hmm.
Some people are like, you can't scale up, and yet they keep doing trainings. So if you can't scale up, I think, but you're trying to do localized trainings and really kind of figure out how to get people to, skills building is part of this, right? So that's some of what people are doing. Also, I think BATJC and this idea of, people have been doing pods, but to actually call it something and have more of a practice around it has really, I think, helped to have so many different local, whether it's your local bunch of friends or whether it's something in a larger community, that these have been strengthening. These pods, that's another way I think that scaling up has happened, and there's curricula available, there's trainings, and so I think we're grappling with the scaling up question, but in some ways many of us have been doing it, and my guess is a lot of you sitting in this room are people that have been really actively engaged in your own communities trying to figure out how to do this. So I'm just going to stop there, and we'll have more time to discuss. Thank you.
Now we're moving to Germany. Melanie.
Right. Thanks for giving that overview of the core principles and the history. And I think that a lot of folks in Germany who are doing transformative justice work have been massively inspired by the U.S. context. So I'm gonna start actually not with my words, but with the words of Vanessa Thompson. And there's just her bio here. She couldn't be here today. It's midnight in Germany right now. But I'm just going to read what she shared. So there's a bunch of lovely thanks, and I'm going to cut those, sorry. Okay, in a way, the fact that I can't be here already shows how difficult it is to have transnational conversations across time zones and possibilities to travel, though I'm structurally privileged in that regard with the US and German passport, language, and related accessibility questions. Transnational conversations, in a way, already challenge various centrisms related to methodological nationalism and imperialism. I think it is here where we can learn a lot from the organizing of transnational refugee movements and the anti-imperial legacy of transnational feminist movements. I'm not going to read Vanessa's bio because the notes, I think, tell her story well. But all of the things that are up on here, there's also access copies that you can take later. So. My scholarly engagement and commitment to transformative justice and abolitionism started and is still strongly embedded in anti-police work and activism. I'm co-founder of the initiative in remembrance of Christy Schwundeck, a Black woman who was shot by police in an unemployment office on May 19, 2011. I'm also co-founder of Cop Watch Frankfurt, an initiative that struggles against racist policing, and against policing in a broader sense, by engaging with people on how to intervene when they see racial profiling happening, as well as how we can keep our communities free from policing. So my thoughts and practices can't be decoupled from ongoing abolitionist activism with various intersectional Black and POC groups in Germany, France, and Switzerland, though I will concentrate on Germany here. I started to engage in these fields when I was about 14 years old. Maybe that was when I first understood and deeply felt that criminalization of especially Black life was not only a condition and imperative of the functioning of US society. Parts of my family live mainly in working class regions of Florida and are exposed to carceral, punitive, and murderous regimes and articulations of structural, slow, and silent violence on an everyday basis. But I also realized that criminalization and premature death through policing and carcerality is constitutive for the context of post-colonial and post-national socialist Germany, as well as other parts of Europe. And this is also true during European colonialism as well. In my work on policing, I often turn to Fanon as he, amongst others, analyzed instructively how policing and criminalization was constitutive of European colonialism and European subject formation. Everyday policing, racist, and urban profiling shaped my experiences and the experiences of my Black and brown friends. Fighting back against policing was part of the urban Black, brown, and migrant youth movements, from the Black Souls to the Turkish Power Boys in the area around Frankfurt. It was strongly linked to the experiences within the Lager system in Germany. Lagers are, it's the word for camp, but it specifically means refugee camps. When I think about abolitionist genealogies in post-colonial Europe, refugee activism against the Lager is crucial. One of the first self-organized refugee groups, The Voice and the Caravan, led by Black refugees, organized campaigns against isolation in Lagers and the Lager system itself. This is abolitionism, though the movements don't always use this term to describe their work. And I think it's important to consider this when talking about abolition, as many turn to the US and question if there is something comparable to the prison industrial complex in Europe. This question, in a way, I think is already centering US experiences. Being attentive to the local and situated contexts enables us to engage with radical forms of abolitionism and how they travel without reproducing methodological nationalism. Especially multi-marginalized groups, particularly refugee women, founded groups like Women in Exile and queer migrant POC Black groups such as Les Migrants in Germany, and in France a group called Collectif Casse Rebelle. These groups did the work of struggling against interpersonal harm within their own communities and state violence and criminalization. They called upon anti-police, anti-Lager, and anti-prison initiatives to leave no one behind, as in the case of Rita Awor Oyunge, and struggle against violence without reinforcing violence, even under conditions in which the murderous practice of deportation is pervasive. This is a crucial challenge to doing continuous community work when people are being taken from you all the time. I think there's still much to do in terms of engaging these abolitionist and transformative justice archives and presences in the context of Europe, and to learn from them as they link abolitionist struggles with the abolition of borders, those in our minds as well as the material border regime. And then a little bit about the situation in Germany. Do I have time? I'm not keeping track very well. Yeah, okay. The current status of the carceral border state or states in Europe is characterized by expansion of security regimes, the strengthening of police laws. In Germany, for instance, several federal states have passed police laws, which are the most repressive since 1945. I'll add that some of these also allow for preventive detention of people who are believed to potentially commit a crime, which was originally a loophole in the law that was related to terrorism, which we know is a racialized category, like legal category for Muslim people and people from the Middle East. And now that's been expanded to kind of boomerang effect, like expanded to the entire German society. So that, further criminalization of poverty and illegalized migration, gentrification, here just lifting up the name of Jin Harita Warren, who's done really great work on this in Berlin in their book Queer Lovers and Hateful Others, and faster deportation regulations and the abandonment of asylum laws. So these are some of the internal articulations of the situation in Germany. They participate in the logic of saving the white woman or the white queer from the brown, black, migrant, refugee male, constructed as always already terrorist, sexist, homo, and queerphobic, costly to the state, which of course further renders black, brown, migrant, refugee women, queers, and non-binary folks vulnerable. And then, so external to Europe, but in relationship to that, also situations of militarization, Germany's support for authoritarian regimes such as the Turkish state, and the externalization of murderous border regimes, for instance, paying militias in Libya to police the seas and the shores, so thinking about the Black Mediterranean as a continuation of enslavement, and build prisons. And this is the war feminist logic of saving brown/black women and queers from brown/black males, while at the same time, of course, not actually saving any of these people because their livelihoods are destroyed. And just quickly, I want to name, maybe some of you followed what happened in Cologne on New Year's Eve in 2015, mass sexual assaults. There was like a media frenzy about it. I'm just paraphrasing, this isn't in Vanessa's notes. Particularly with a focus on refugee and migrant perpetrators and the construction of the North African perpetrator with the word Nafri. And Vanessa points out that this figure is, a sibling to the construction of the Black Rioter and the rapist. And there's a long history of this figure in Germany related to post-World War I occupation of the Rhine area with Black French soldiers and the relationships that they had with white German women and the children that they had. I think two pieces of carceral feminist legislation to talk about here are reforms to the law governing sexual offenses and the so-called Prostitution Protection Act, both of which happened in 2017, which were targeting illegalized sex workers in the name of protecting them. Also show that carceral feminism is not only complicit, but also actively delivers the grounds for the expansion of the carceral state. I'm gonna end here because I think we've said a lot. And I will switch to me. And, I won't change my voice though. That would be weird. Okay, so thank you, Vanessa, when you one day watch this video. I think that letter really does an amazing job of laying out the dimensions of the punitive state in Germany and the state of abolitionist responses. And I just want to dive a little bit into transformative justice alternatives that are happening in Germany that I know of for a little bit. And I can give a quick introduction. I lived in Germany for 10 years. I lived in Berlin. I'm originally from the US. And I brought what I had learned with me. So I was introduced to community accountability from some very visionary, my boss, Maura Baerly, who works with Move to End Violence, and some other amazing colleagues in college doing anti-violence work. And so when I moved to Berlin, I was thinking very much about collective responsibility. Obviously, Germany is an interesting place to think about collective responsibility because there's been attempts and massive failures to really reckon with the past. And that usually just means the Holocaust. There's total, almost deafening silence about Germany's colonial genocide in present-day Namibia. So, as Erica mentioned, I co-founded the Transformative Justice Collective in Berlin about 8 years ago, and we were working largely in leftist and white-dominated communities. And we started to get more and more requests for support and intervention in concrete cases of violence, usually sexual violence and interpersonal violence, sexual violence and partner violence. And we were really overwhelmed. So we started having conversations with people in the US that we knew to just be like, what are you doing? We're trying this, what's working for you? And I always had this sense of oh, y'all are the mothership. You will know, you'll have the answers. And then when I talked to people, I was I figured out that everybody's making it up as we go along and doing our best. And those conversations snowballed into an interview project that became my master's research called the What Really Makes Us Safe project. And then that became a community engagement project to kind of bring what I had learned from folks in North America back to my communities in Berlin. And so I got a lot of my collaborators to contribute little articles to this book that we made. And it was really kind of modeled on INCITE's toolkit on law enforcement violence, really to kind of explore what's the situation with state violence in Germany, what's the situation with gender-based violence, particularly what are refugee and migrant women experiencing, and then what's going on with transformative justice alternatives. And all of that you can find on the internet. There's interview excerpts and my findings and videos of the community events that we did at whatreallymakesussafe.com. The link to the German site is broken today, so of all days, so you'll just have to wait on that. And I do want to say, as I shift now, I still am a practitioner of TJ, but I'm thinking about things more as a researcher, and I know that one of the downsides of this hyper-local experimentation that Mimi mentioned is a lack of documentation, and I think that's one role that researchers can play that's actually useful. Giving people an opportunity to tell their stories and reflect on their experiences, that people often don't have time for that in their work. And story sharing, as you named, Mimi, has been a real backbone of the movement. Thinking about the revolution starts at home as a kind of Bible, and now Ijeris Dixon and Leah Lakshmi Pipsina Samarasina's book that's coming out like tomorrow or next month or whatever, Beyond Survival, as like continuing this. And I think that was also our effort with this book, was to just name and document what other groups are already doing. And I can say briefly, you know, there's a growing queer, so QD, BIPOC, queer, trans, black, queer, trans, bi, black, indigenous, people of color community in Berlin that's very international. And I think there's a lot of internal conversations and practice around TJ that's happening in that community. And I think that there is a lot of influence from the US and like US models. And there's a lot of struggle around how to translate that locally without reproducing US imperialism. And one thing that Nadia Samor, who is my dear collaborator and wife on this book, she emphasized that when we make the book, we really need to decenter US comparisons and focus on Germany. And we tried to center groups and get contributions from groups that were like intersectionally resisting many levels of violence. A lot of them do services and survivor support for folks who are experiencing, you know, police violence, racist violence, survivors of interpersonal violence. And of course, they're also always doing political work, even if they're getting funding for being service organizations. And those folks aren't necessarily using abolition or transformative justice as their framework. And just thinking about how, you know, TJ's been a useful framework for drawing together. That was a useful framework for the book. But it can also cut things out of the frame. And it's been interesting for me to track like who feels comfortable using that term and how it's taken up. For a long time we used the term in English, and then I was really adamant about like we need to translate this into German because it's kind of a trendy thing to use English terms, even if they don't make sense for people. And so I think that's another thing is like, you know, when models are traveling from the US to Germany, there's a lot of class and education privilege involved in that importation. And when they're coming through academic institutions, a lot of what gets translated is like, is theory and critique, and instead of like practice and organizing. And yeah, and it's been very interesting to track the translation of community accountability and transformative justice into the German context. For instance, the word survivor in many ways in Germany is reserved for Holocaust survivors. You really can't touch the topic of perpetration with white German people without National Socialism being in the air somewhere. And also just the word community. The collective translated Communities Against Rape and Abuse's first early text that was, I think, influential for many of us, taking risks. And we had a lot of trouble with the word community. Mm-hmm. And I have people who come up to me when I do stuff in Germany all the time and are like, but I don't have a community. And I think lots of people in the US also feel that, but I've thought about, you know, in many ways that didn't make sense to me. I was like, oh no, like especially in the German left, there are many very explicitly boundaried and sometimes explicitly policed communities. There are house projects, there are political groups, event spaces, parties, which to my mind are very clearly communities. So what's going on that people don't connect with that emotionally as their community? And also just on a discursive level, I've thought a bit about how in Germany people speak about society as like a thing, and in the US we don't really talk about society, we talk about community. So I think that's just something we can put on the table to explore.
We're going to move now to the folks working in the UK. Okay. Molly and Kelsey.
That's us.
Yay!
We're really excited to be here and engaging in this conversation for lots of reasons, but also sometimes it can feel quite hopeless in the UK. And so we thought we'd start by talking a bit about the carceral state, going on to talk about carceral feminism, and finishing with maybe some sprinklings of hope in relation to the transformative justice practices that are emerging.
Yeah, and I just wanted to thank you again for getting us here, organising this, like writing my CV so I could apply for this. That was like very helpful of you. So, but yeah, so thank you. Am I starting? Yes. So I'm Kelsey. I'm with a group called Community Action on Prison Expansion, also known as Communities Against Prison Expansion, depending on whatever, and also part of a new group called Cradle Community, and actually a few other grassroots groups as well. In the UK, like at the moment, we're in the midst of like one of the biggest ever sort of like prison expansion projects in UK history. In 2016, the government announced that they wanted to build 10,000 new prison places in these 6 what they're calling mega prisons, as well as 5 what they're calling community units or community prisons for women. And they also want to like open what they're calling secure schools, which are prisons for children, 12 to 17-year-olds, as well as a mega detention center, and just like seeing also an increase in like police powers around stop and search, which I think is the same as stop and frisk laws here, and then also like just like tagging and community policing. So we're sort of like in the midst of this like massive expansion of the carceral state at the moment. Most of those mega prisons have been delayed because they actually like don't really have the money to spend on building all these prisons, but they really, really want to. One of the prisons has been outright rejected. It was and scrapped as a plan. That was the one that was going to be in South Wales, in Port Talbot, and that was in huge part because of community organising. Most of the other ones have been delayed. However, one of them in the Midlands has started to, they've broken ground and they're like starting construction on it. And then one in Yorkshire in the north of England has been given approved planning permission very recently as well, but it hasn't been like contracted out yet. So those 2 are the ones that we're like kind of focusing on while keeping an eye on like the other ones that have so far been delayed. We're kind of in an interesting point as well because most of the companies that have been involved in like building prisons and stuff have actually like collapsed in the recent years, and the one that has the contract for the one that's starting to go ahead, they're like on the verge of collapse. We actually have like a very immature meme-based campaign against Kia, the construction company, trying to just like disrupt them along with like other ways. There's been like a massive sort of like move towards having like what they've called a hostile environment towards immigrants as well. So there's also a lot of resistance against like detention and deportation in the UK. I think it's important to like also acknowledge that like we have like almost 1/5 of our prisoners are held in like private prisons, but in the UK actually our public prisons are also for the most part like privately run, so it's still private companies that get all of the contracts around what we call like facilities management and like catering and all these kinds of things, as well as the like prison labour that happens in prisons. And if they were to build these mega prisons, that's going to be like a huge expansion of the like exploited prison labour that's happening in the UK, which like private companies will benefit from. So even when we talk about privatisation, it's not actually like as cut and dry anyway, but obviously as abolitionists we believe like all prisons like should be abolished, whether they're private or state run. And yeah, in terms of sort of like the resistance, and because we talk about like non-reformist reforms, but actually in the UK at the moment it feels like the biggest priority is to like block the current expansion before we can really like gun for these actual like these more abolitionist reforms. But what we are seeing is sort of what we're trying to do is like challenge the overall narratives around prisons and policing, because in the UK, like, there isn't really that much like sort of mainstream critique of the idea of policing. Like, there's still a huge like public safety narrative around the police. There's like been a huge, at the moment, like if you were to, particularly if you Google any of the towns where they're trying to build any of these prisons, all of them are ones that have been hit massively by austerity, like loss of industry, loss of jobs. And if you were to Google any of them, you'll see like just loads of articles about like knife crime and youth crime and all these kinds of things. So they're trying to like fuel people up to feel really, really scared all the time, which then lends to their narrative that, oh, that's all because of austerity cuts to the police. Therefore, the police need more funding, and therefore we need to build more prisons and put more money into that system. And very little sort of like overall like narrative that said actually we'd see much less of any of this violence, which we've actually seen. Like, there isn't an increase in youth crime like by numbers, it's just that we're hearing about it more. Obviously if we were to see an investment in our communities, we would see less of that violence anyway, but like that's not the narrative. So at the moment we're trying to sort of build a narrative to counter that and do a lot of that work, which I'm involved in terms of doing sort of like abolition workshops and supporting local campaigns that are trying to resist the building of these new prisons, sort of like helping campaigns and campaigners sort of like develop skills to build those campaigns. A lot of the work that we do is actually, in terms of our strategy, is like inspired by critical resistance and other groups that have been involved in jail fights. So as well as Fight Toxic Prisons, who's over there, and we kind of a lot of stuff around sort of like protesting on environmental grounds or trying to mess with planning permissions, as well as like direct action and community-led campaigns of any kinds of objections or any kinds of ways that we can resist. We basically employ all of those tactics, so we definitely lend very heavily from work that's being done in the US.
Yeah, so jumping on the lack of discourse that exists around criticism in relation to the police. To put it simply, carceral feminism just exists in abundance in the UK. So I worked in frontline support for survivors of sexual violence within a rape crisis centre for a number of years. 3 years doing outreach work specifically with survivors with additional marginalisations, and another 3 or so years around the criminal legal system. And I think in that regard it's important to first understand that sexual violence support in the UK was created by and for a particular demographic of survivors. And while it's increasingly recognised within, and I say this with quotes, the sector, and also within the academy, that there's a need for something different, something more creative, something non-carceral, a lot of the people that do that work continue to hold on to carceral views or beliefs just on some level. And I think, again, the some level is really important for us to understand. So often when we do the work, we speak about this thing called the merry-go-round, and it's like round and round you're going on this system that you know doesn't work, unable to step off or let go to the carceral views, but also unable to articulate what actually something new, something different could look like. So I guess in terms of this inability to imagine things outside carcerality, it's also, I guess, important to understand the exact context of carceral feminism. So we have what I would call rampant professionalisation of services, which I know exists in all of the different contexts that kind of, I'm not so sure about Germany, but definitely in the US. We have that alongside like devastating austerity that's been in existence for the last 10 years. And what that's done is it's led to this kind of competition for frontline support work. We call it competitive tendering, where a certain amount of money goes out. I don't know if it's the same in the US. I imagine there are massive overlaps. But this like push and constant competition for money kind of results in what I call simple solutions to violence. And by this I mean solutions that like really only focus around single access understandings of harm, as opposed to taking more structural views of oppression. So just to list some of them, there are so many. We have the Domestic Violence and Abuse Bill, which has massive similarities to, is it VAWA is the acronym? VAWA. Huge similarities in relation to the pushes for kind of increased sentencing and not really, I guess, kind of no funding for specialist services. We also have providing services for the sake of services. I can expand on that more if we need to, but I know I don't have much time. Services agreeing to do things like embed immigration officers into frontline services, the purpose being to perpetrate perpetrators of harm, without kind of linking the ways in which that can directly impact survivors who are most marginalised survivors with tenuous immigration status, for example. We have excluding trans people from services to keep women safe. We have increasing support, and by women I mean a specific type of women, cis women. We have support for increased funding for sexual violence services, but only the services that are focused on the criminal legal system. So the service that I worked for, a rape crisis service, we saw huge increases in demand for support around the criminal legal system. Actually, a huge amount of those survivors were also asking for different things, alternative supports. That support was only in relation to the criminal legal system. We did no housing support, no immigration support, because we weren't allowed to, and we were also only allowed to support a specific type of survivor. And by types of survivors, I mean survivors of rape or childhood sexual abuse, which again feeds into really dangerous narratives over who is perpetrating violence and who is experiencing violence. And we also weren't allowed to support trans people as a service, only specific types of trans people who had completed transition. We also have
like legal.
Yeah, exactly, legal transition within the UK. In addition to that, we also have the kind of increasing failures around our criminal legal system, or at 10-year lows of prosecutions. So all of this combined together, we have like increasing funding for criminal legal support. We also have the system continuing to actually worsen, I would say, in many respects. Leads to this kind of really strange rhetoric in terms of carceral feminism around increased pushing for reforming the system. So Kelsey mentioned reforms. The actual only reforms that carceral feminists are talking about is improving the system. So ploughing more money in. I would imagine that at some point within the future we'll see something very similar to what's happened in relation to domestic violence, which is something like sexual violence courts. I can see it happening. There's a very high chance it will happen at some point within the UK. And I guess going back to carceral feminism in terms of like that messy place in between that exists within many frontline workers, we know that these solutions don't work. Survivors come to us and they ask for some other things, but there's no ability to articulate what other things could look like. Frontline workers and academics as well, and I think it's really important to hold academics to account here, just won't let go of carcerality. The reasons often given by people doing the work is there's not enough time, there's no space, there's no money, there's no nothing to do the work of reimagining. It's as though vicarious trauma and burnout excuses everything. I think like the work of Alison Phipps is really useful for us all to be looking at in terms of the deeper issues at play in the UK, like the classic argument that a lot of these feminists in power who are white women predominantly from particular class backgrounds won't relinquish power when it comes to privilege. The work that I'm doing at the moment is about interrogating what limits our imagination to think creatively around non-carceral options. Importantly, I guess, to kind of maybe bring it to a slightly more hopeful place, there are sparks of abolitionist views within services. There are frontline workers that do abolitionist work, but then also go into work the next day and work within the criminal legal system. And contextualizing that these sparks exist in silos, and there's a real danger and a risk of these silos being crushed. But there is some hope.
I think it's interesting when we talk about transformative justice and prison abolition in the UK, because it is often like you said, sort of like pockets within things, and there'll be people who you find who work in the sector or things like that who then they're like, oh, I'm an abolitionist, but like I have to go and do this for my job, or and so it is complicated. But I think there are some groups that are outwardly doing transformative justice and community accountability work. They are all like pretty small, and a lot of the work again has been inspired by people in the US, and particularly the Bay Area. And so it's been really interesting for me. I came here in the summer to then see actually just like how much our work had been influenced by what's going on here. And obviously we're trying to now figure out, like, in terms of the scaling up question, like what does it look like in a UK context? And there's definitely a very different culture in the UK around activism, around movement building, that can be frustrating at times. But and also like people of colour are just like a really small part of the population. And so organising for anti-racist struggles, like you are always just like such the minority, and particularly as soon as you leave London, things become very, very white. So I want to like mention that as well. But groups that are doing this work, there's a sort of like a space that was started by some people actually in the sort of like DIY punk scene that's called DIY Space for London, and that is run like under like transformative justice principles, and it's like a community space, and they have like a transformative justice group that are starting to like sort of do more community accountability work. Sisters Uncut is a grassroots feminist direct action group that are prison abolitionists who have very much been inspired by INCITE and critical resistance, and these kinds of groups to try and draw attention to the ways that that survivors are treated within the criminal justice system and are impacted by that system, and also about those intersections of domestic violence and criminal justice. And I do think that Sisters has had like a really big influence on the wider leftist scene, and has like a really big sort of reputation for their like approach to accountability and things. But again, like that's also that's another like intentional community. It's lots of people who like come together to organize, and that has its own issues in terms of accountability and stuff, because we find it difficult when there are issues of accountability, because people can just leave. There's no like formalized membership. There's no kind of, you know, there's like kind of a lot of issues that are within that, but also they are one of the most proactive groups, I think, in terms of that community accountability, in terms of doing political learning as they go, and in terms of having caucuses and things like that, like trying to really like talk about identity and talk about accountability in lots of different ways, but there's always room for improvement, right? And then we in Hollaback, London, we also, me and Molly, have been delivering bystander intervention trainings across the country, and sometimes in other countries, which I think is like has been really interesting in terms of as a way to like bring abolition into like people's daily lives, because bystander intervention is one of those things where we try to actually shift the existing culture, and we try to create that community accountability, create that incentive for people to act when they witness violence in public space particularly, and to sort of like bring in some of those elements from the women's sector in terms of like breaking silence and like sharing stories, but also we've been having conversations lately about like how do we expand that work to really make sure that it is properly like anti-racist work as well. How do we talk about power in terms of bystander intervention, in terms of like who are you as the bystander? And I feel like because this training actually came from the women's sector, there can be a little bit of we've been having these conversations about sort of like whiteness, and the way that a lot of these trainings, they center around the kind of like anything that makes you feel uncomfortable is valid, and like actually for white women that's not always the case, or like, you know what I mean, like that's like being uncomfortable is not the same as being unsafe, and that we need to like talk about our power that we do hold in spaces as well as the power that we are like under. So it's we're trying to like broaden that bystander intervention training to really like take into account like all those different power dynamics, and really like get into the depths of how that would work. And so that has developed into also this organization that me and a couple of friends have started, which is called Cradle, which is like with the aim of trying to like build community capacity and run these trainings, and sort of work with different communities to figure out exactly like what are the issues that you're having in terms of safety, in terms of accountability, and like how can we like, you know, what skills can we pull in from other places, what are the trainings that you might need, and what are the ways that we can start to like build that accountability. Because like, and one of the things in the UK is I feel like, and this is the case everywhere, but I feel like London and the UK is like very much like in the depths of this, there's like a huge sort of thing around like, oh, it's none of my business, and like, yeah, so we're trying to really break through that, and that is one of the sort of like first steps, is to actually, because when we work through scenarios around like how would you support this person in this situation, if you're talking about someone's neighbor, if that's who it is in the scenario, or you're talking about a stranger in any kind of way, people cut themselves off immediately, and they're like, well, I don't know what I would do except call the police. And then if you say like, oh, what if it was your cousin or your auntie or whatever, and then people immediately like, well, I'd bash down the door and I'd be right in there. So it's kind of like actually like, okay, so how do we bring that element of community into actual communities? How do we break down those barriers? And how do we actually sort of start those conversations about actually like abusers like isolate people, right? So someone who's being abused is more likely to not feel like it's going to have to be strangers who intervene, right? So I think we're kind of starting to like build more of those networks and have more of those conversations, but it's all very much sort of like just starting to grow at the moment.
Okay. Hey, so thanks so much for letting us join your conversation there. First up, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the sovereign lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and pay my deep respects to elders past and present. So I'm over here in Naarm or in Melbourne. My name's Loz, or Lauren, and I primarily work at the intersection of intimate partner or interpersonal and state-sanctioned violence. And I was told, given a great range of questions, and told we've got about 6 or so minutes just to say a couple of things, and then Anne-lise will speak specifically to some of the examples happening locally here. So I elected to just do a little bit of context around the carceral state and carceral feminism and queer punitivity here in this context. So I guess specifically in the context that I'm working, it's worth noting that decades of feminist-led campaigning around primarily what gets called family violence or intimate partner violence led to an enormous royal commission, so a government-led royal commission that looked at what was dubbed an epidemic of family violence. And as part of that royal commission, what we saw was a huge number of submissions that really centred police as first responders in situations where there's intimate partner or family violence, and subsequently a whole lot of recommendations that came out of that Royal Commission that absolutely entrenched and extended the role of police as central to family violence, but also authorised a whole set of different responses, different powers, and various different aspects of policing associated with this idea that police equate to safety when responding to gendered or intimate partner violence. And so what we're now seeing is the rollout of those recommendations. There were no corresponding accountability measures or anything associated with that. And so what we've seen is a huge wave of expansion of family violence policing in Victoria. We're seeing a massive rise in criminalisation through family violence policing. At the moment, our prison population is at the highest level it's been at in so many years. The current rate's not been seen in Victoria since 1895. And of the different rising rates of incarceration, Aboriginal women are the fastest growing prison population here in Victoria. And so what we're seeing is this sort of the impacts of the ways that when policing is authorised, obviously that then drives police expansion, and then it drives criminalisation. So that's sort of the context of the work that we're doing here, and the moment in which transformative justice and community accountability organising sits. And this is a change. Originally, many feminist anti-violence movements in this location were very adversarial with police. They were very sceptical of police. But over time, this sort of pressure to kind of build relationships and in the name of safety has meant that now there's a situation where it's quite difficult trying to decouple some of that and to regain some of that terrain against co-option. So, in terms of that question around who's doing transformative justice or community accountability inspired work and which models they're using in response to those specific harms, one example that I would use locally is our work on building frameworks and trainings that are focused on decentering police in the context of safety planning and crisis responses. We've elected to do this because of the focus on risk assessment, the language of safety that really dominates every discussion when it comes to responses to family violence, and also that this is where we notice that the knee-jerk 000 reflex or assumptions that police are sites of safety, even when it's abundantly clear they're not, is most present. So of late, we've been approaching this from the perspective of capacity building and trainings with a view to getting in advance of a crisis. In doing this, I'd note that we've been informed by some amazing work and thinking locally and internationally. In that region of the world, we'd shout out to the Northwest Network and others for their thinking about organising in advance of crisis situations. And so we've been running a series of different workshops and trainings with communities that are focused on asset mapping in response to family violence crises or intimate partner violence crises and that harm, and safety planning and risk management in a way that decenters police and that focuses on community assets. And in doing that work, we've also drawn on some of the really useful and amazing tools developed by Creative Interventions and others. So we've sort of built and adapted some of those for a local context. I realise I'm at 5 minutes already. Sorry that I'm talking so fast. I'm just trying to get a couple of points in. So in terms of that question around the challenges and the opportunities, I would say that what we see locally is that there are some really huge challenges around what it takes to kind of speak back to what can feel like a juggernaut of carceral responses to violence. And that includes the whole suite of things that go along with that. So in this location, we'll see police self-evaluate all of these family violence reforms. So how do we speak back to that as communities and actually talk about the lived experience or the consequences of that policing? As always, capacity challenges. And certainly time frame, I think, challenges that often apply to community accountability or transformative justice responses. So that feeling that it can be really hard to get out from underneath the stream of ongoing harm to do the necessary planning for crises in advance. But we also think that there are some really significant opportunities at this moment as well, and that the sheer scale of the police expansion actually also makes visible the scale of the impact. And so as the policing impacts those people who are the most targeted by both gendered and state violence, there is an increasing call for and appetite for alternatives. And so we really see this as a very important solidarity moment and a moment to radicalise or kind of re-radicalise, both to recapture some of that political and organising terrain, as well as to resist co-option and to do the work building skills for accountable communities and to develop community safety strategies further. And I'll leave some of the specifics of other examples to Anne-lise. But thank you for having me.
So Anne-lise couldn't Skype in, but sent me a few images and words. So actually, Rob, if you could pull up that PowerPoint. It's, yeah, that one. Click go. Do I have time to read them?
We have like 5 minutes left, so I know we were ambitious, which is a good thing, and international, and trying to, in our hour and a half minutes in which we were already DIY renegade and DIY. So I'm wondering if it would be more useful to have them up on the wall as we're talking, but have the opportunity for a couple of people in the room to make brief comments, but then also to have people share at the end, come up and chat at the end. Does that sound good?
Yeah, there's also a copy of Anne-lise's comments.
There's a bunch of resources up here, but is there folks in the room who want to make coming from other contexts, want to add questions or comments, and then we can have maybe a couple of minutes for responses.
Molly, you mentioned that your current research is interrogating what limits our capacities to imagine non-carceral solutions. I'm curious to hear more about that, because I feel like that's kind of foundational. If we can't even bring it up, then how can we move forward?
Yeah, I mean, I'm super early in the research. I'm like a month and a half in, and my supervisors are also in the room. It's basically, I got to this place with the research, which is, or with my general thinking, which is that we constantly are thinking about what the problems are, right? All of the research that exists documents kind of failing after failing with the criminal legal system, and it just, like you stewardship, which I think holds lots of potentials, but there's also stuff around like, I mean, I can go super theoretical on like habitus, which is like the ways in which we, the habits that we all possess, and like why do we fall into those habits, and also like what counter habits can we develop as well to like unlimit imagination, to push for something new. Like, that's the hope of the research, but like, it's, 6 weeks in, so.
It's really fascinating.
Maybe one more, and it could also be from the panel here, like it could also be a comment or an observation. I think this is an opportunity to try to do some mapping, across borders and boundaries, and to think about different translations of work, limitations of work, so it doesn't have to be a question, it can also just be an observation from anyone. And one or two more.
This question is great. Okay, this question doesn't do what you just said. It's 4 minutes or less, right? But I feel like when I talk about this type of work to people, again, it's the limitations of imagination. They're like, what do you, and it's what I struggle with as well, like, what do you do with people that do, like, people always go to worst case scenario, like somebody like Ted Bundy or something, like, what would you do with Ted Bundy, right? And so asking the panel, like, what kind of effective strategies have you seen for because my friends are always like, well, what, like, I want a concrete, like, so what kind of work have you done in your communities that you've seen as being effective in like real life situations where you're doing this transformative justice, like people actually harmed, and then how you work with that?
Well, I'm going to turn to another example, which is Philly Stands Up has been really great in terms of focusing so much on work with people who've done harm. And they're not around anymore, the people are. But they did their work for quite a while, and they also document it really well. In terms of, but I also was hungry for like, okay, what did it look like? And I almost recently got to have like an hour and a half with folks that I actually have known for quite a while. In terms of really, I mean, what did it take was having a kind of a larger community, punk anarchist community that was going to be like, you know what, you have to do, if you want to stick around, and we do want you to stick around, you need to go to this place. Then there was a place to actually go to. Then folks that like really, and they, fucked up a lot at the beginning. It was just a mess. They had a lot of implosions. But they hung in there together and had, cisgender, male-identified people, gender non-conforming folks. I mean, they really ended up having a group of folks that really hung in there. They would meet with people like once a week for 2 years. So some of it was like, are we going to be able to do that? But also some of it is like, how do you create community where you're like, okay, I'm going to be in this with you. That's what we're going to do. Not just you, but a few of us are going to do this. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to stick to this. And they also had like really interesting things that are really counter to some of the things that I know I and other people have done, which is like, you have at least some admission that you did something at some point fairly soon. And they're like, no, they tell folks, coming and working with us is not an admission that you did anything at all. But that would change over time. But there were like things, I know I'm getting a little bit technical, but there are things that were really, really useful to hear. Also, a lot around care, modeling both accountability, like I'm taking my time out of, I don't get paid for this. I'm doing this my political work too, so I expect the same from you. To like, what are you eating? Do you have, taking care of your needs, which is not something that I know that we did at first. You're like pissed off. Like, I don't care what you need. You need to be here. Basically, I think there's like a more of an understanding of the fact. The fact is, I think of some of our earlier work and was somewhat punitive. But then how are you not just like, whatever you want? I think that's the tension that we still have. But I felt like I learned even more again from they're just having sat with so many different people and held them in a very long and firm and caring process, and that they were so accountable to each other and had formed this really beautiful community. We don't all have those ingredients, but I think a lot of this is how do we start building them, right? And I think that's what so many different communities are just starting to do, and so many more people like, kind of like, just, how do you deal with your own friends? How do you deal with your own family? If you can't, how do you talk to people about that? And I think a lot of that more nurturing and caring work is starting to happen around what does transformative justice principles really look like in daily life. I do feel like that's happening more, along with, you know, folks that are like, oh, we used to do that, it didn't work very well. This is what we've learned. It's little small successes, right? We still don't have a lot of those documented, but I keep hearing from so many more people like, you know what, we did something that actually worked pretty well. So I was just saying to Leah too, I was like, we gotta get back to like getting those stories from people. Also a lot of, like in the earlier days, I know some people had stories, but they were like, for economy purposes, you cannot share that story because we can't have you champion your like great accountability work, right? But in some ways, then we didn't have any stories. So I was like, I get it, but these things are shifting, and so I think we have more examples. I just wanted to give you a couple of things that I have just recently learned from the work that Felice does, because I found it really important.
Thank you for sharing that, Mimi, and thank you for patience and listening. I want to just lift up all the people who traveled at a conference that is focused on, you know, transnationalism and how hard it is to be able to get here. So I just want to say thank you, both those people who participated virtually and are here in the flesh, and also people who came from other parts in California, from community-based organizations who don't need to be here at an academic conference. So thank you for that work, and Mimi for the many years, if I say decades, of leadership around this. I just feel like that is so important. I also know that Melanie and Mimi are also speaking again at NWSA around this work, and I don't know if other folks in the room are. I know Sam Lamble is, and other people. So look, there's so much good TJ work on the program and organizing work, and maybe other people are also speaking again in the program, so check that out. And thank you, and also to Robert and Melanie for doing all the, so thank you. And there's also resources on the side here, and this crew is interested in trying to continue these sort of nascent internationalism threads, so if you're interested, come up, talk to some of us, and we'll make sure that you stay connected to it.